Hi, church friends. We are in our second week of self-denial, a 3-week series where we are going through the book of Esther. Last week, the focus was on Haman and thinking about the idol of self. This week, we're going to focus in on Esther herself and think about what it's like to live life on the front lines and how we can be faithful in those situations. Before we're introduced to Esther, we're given a view of the situation that she sort of finds herself in as we sort of zoom into palace life. At the opening of the book, King Xerxes is giving this lavish banquet for all the nobles and officials, and it's a lengthy process where he offers his hospitality to display all of his wealth and his power for 180 days. And at the end of this time, he has a 7-day banquet. And we can kind of see from this that he is a man of pride, of great might, of wealth, and that he really wants to impress people with how great a king he is. Queen Vashti, married to the king, she only really makes a brief kind of appearance in this story, but her appearance is important. Because she's the predecessor of Esther, and she ends up being dethroned or demoted for standing on a moral issue in a sense. It's been suggested that when the king asked her to come and show herself before the party that he had, that in a sense he was asking her to show up naked. And when you look at it from that light, you can maybe understand why it was that she said no, that she didn't come. But the king and his advisors focus on the fact that she disobeyed more than they actually put attention on why she disobeyed. And this is really very likely because the why she disobeyed would have made the king lose face. That is, to show weakness or to lose respect, and it was vitally important that the king always maintained this sort of sense of dignity and his position. And so rather than focusing on the fact that the king made an inappropriate request, they focus on her disobedience, and this is really to shift shame away from the king and place it on Queen Vashti. And this is really worth holding in sight, because I think that kind of a memory in the life of the palace and the court is what Esther walks into. In chapter 2, the king it's proposed to the king that he looks for someone better than Queen Vashti to take her place. And this proposal is accepted, and what it means is that they go out through all the land and they gather up all the beautiful virgins and bring them to the king's palace to be part of the harem. I don't think that these ladies and their families would have had a lot of choice about whether or not they went. They just had to go. And it's really at this point in the story that Esther makes her appearance. So we learn that Esther is an orphan and she's raised by her cousin Mordecai, that they are Jews living in exile. So she has some noticeable disadvantages. She comes from, I guess, a low status in the place that they are currently living. She's a foreigner. She's lacking in power, position, family connection. In effect, she really doesn't have much of a voice and she's very vulnerable. Her favourable points, the only things that we learn about is that she has a beautiful figure and that she is very beautiful. And of course, when she enters the palace, we start to see that she's actually able to win favour, firstly with the chief eunuch. So these are the sort of things that sit in her favour. Her nationality and her background are hidden, and this is on the advice of Mordecai, and this is mentioned twice in chapter 2. Firstly in verse 10, before she becomes queen, and then secondly after she is queen. And this whole segment of passage kind of maybe gives us some clues that we want to pay attention to. One of them really is around protection. So one of the reasons I think Mordecai advised her to do this was firstly to protect herself. The second thing is that later it becomes about protecting maybe a divine purpose that he's starting to see could be there. The fact that she starts to get attention and that she's gaining favour, and he sees that as a divine purpose. So that's one thing that we can kind of note. The other thing is around the roles that Mordecai plays. He has a role of father in her life, and he is concerned about her well-being. So he walks back and forth daily into the palace, hearing of news of how she is. He also has this role of advisor, and you can kind of see in their relationship that there is good trust between them. And he continues to advise her. And as I said earlier, some of this would have been protection for her personally, and the role of a father, he has that concern for her. But he also started to think bigger. And then the other thing I think noting about that is they both show a loyalty to the king. And so there's this assassination plot that is uncovered, and between the two of them, they bring it to the king's attention, and so that he is preserved in his kingship and in his life. It's good to kind of see that although Esther gets to a place of position in terms of being a queen, she is still one of many women in the court. And as we've seen from Queen Vashti's story, that position is not necessarily secure for a long time. And so I think that we just have to remember that she holds his favour for now, and then what happens will happen. Chapter 3, we're not going to focus too much on that, but that one just helps to, in the storyline, expose Haman's heart and his plot to destroy the nation. Probably what's good for us to note from that story and how it impacts Esther is really the high trust and value that the king places on Haman, and so they have a relationship as such that the king willingly allows and hands over the power for Haman to be able to plan the destruction of a whole nation. And at the end of this chapter, there is this verse 15 in the second part where it talks about the king and Haman sitting down to have a drink while the city of Susa is bewildered. And I kind of imagine this kind of scene where they've had a busy day in the court, making rules, listening, advising, writing this edict that goes out to the land, and then they just sit down to relax, to chill out, have a drink, chat. And in the meantime, in the city, this concern, this uprising is starting to happen because of this edict that Haman and the king have made. Chapter 4 tells us that this news goes out, and it's open season on the Jewish people. And Mordecai, as he hears this news, he obviously does some homework around it and gathers information, but he also has this open expression of mourning. He tears his clothes, he wears sackcloth, he's wailing. Can you just picture this public display of a man in this state, is so grieved by what he has learned and the tragedy that is going to come? Esther, when she hears about it, at first she tries to comfort him, and when he won't be comforted, she sends messages to say what's going on. And so the stage is really set from this point on for Esther, because she's been someone who to a degree is quite protected and maybe sheltered in her palace life, and now she's being drawn into the front lines. Maybe for you, you don't really see yourself on the front lines. It's a terminology that's taken from war zone areas. Some of us, we feel like we're in the war zone from time to time. But whether you think you're in a front line or not, we all do face challenges personally within our families or our social context, our workplaces, the things we do in our social life, our worship spaces. if we're seeking to represent God wherever we go or however we're placed, how might we do this? And I think we can learn a lot from what unfolds in Esther's story. In response to her query, what's going on, Mordecai once again kind of steps into his advisor role, and he goes beyond just answering her question. He gives her detailed information so that she can understand the situation, who's involved, the lengths that they've gone to, and the big picture ramifications for her people. And he also gives her instructions, really noting she has a role to play and that she must act. So the first thing I think that we can learn from this is when we're in a situation, it's helpful to ask what's going on and look for clarity and understanding. Who are the people that can give us good information? We want to try to be well informed, thoughtful, as we seek to navigate our way through. Once she's got the information, Esther's initial reply is to point out that she doesn't have that much influence. Even as a queen, she is restricted in going before the king. And she notes it's been 30 days since I was last called. So palace protocol is that to go before the king without an invitation is to cause an offence. And it's an offence that is worthy of death. And I do wonder if in the back of her mind sits Queen Vashti, who just disobeyed a command to preserve her modesty, and in a sense that was it for her and her life as queen. Do you think that Esther was afraid? I suspect that she was greatly afraid, and it's a natural, normal response. And so facing fears and limitations is something that I think we all have to do, and this is another sort of a learning point. Most of us probably feel like we have limited influence to make any real difference, especially if it seems like quite a big thing. And we also tend to think about why we can't do stuff, or if you're like me, that's what you do. And so we have to work through those limitations that we feel we have, or restrictions that are present. So in a sense, Esther does a risk assessment, and the outcome is to see that there is a high risk to her life, and actually there isn't much guarantee that she's going to achieve a reprieve for the Jewish people. So maybe she's sort of edging towards saying, no, this is not a good idea. But Mordecai doesn't let it sit there. The things that she raises are true, but he brings in a bigger perspective. He says God's purposes and plans don't rely on one person for them to happen. And this doesn't necessarily mean it's an opt-out for us. Oh, well, if it doesn't rely on me, I don't need to do anything. Because Mordecai is saying, in effect, that God's people will get relief and deliverance somehow. He might not know how. And if Esther doesn't act, God's able to do something. But he does point out to Esther that inaction does not equate to safety. And I think that's always good for us to hold in sight as well. But the point is that God does choose to work through people. And so she might very well be God's chosen agent for this situation. So like Esther, each one of us might feel that we've got limited influence to make a difference. And so we have to sort of think about, well, how do we increase our view or help others to increase our view, much like what Mordecai did for Esther? Maybe you feel like you've got limited influence, but what things might help remind you that it's not all on you? Maybe it's that you remember that God invites you to partner with him. Maybe it's just as simple as remembering that God is with you. Whatever it is, thinking about what is it that helps you to take a step back, see a bigger picture, but also see that there's a bigger solution than just you. And this, of course, takes faith. So Esther takes the information that Mordecai provides. She sees this big threat looming. She's grappling with the question of what is at stake if she gets involved. She knows on her own it might not happen, but she's holding on to hope and faith that she's not alone in acting. And with this in mind, she says, I will do it. I will do action. And so she does so with a couple of things that I think of as action and preparation. The first thing she does is that she calls for communal prayer and fasting. So she's seeking divine presence and intervention, and she's not doing that prayer just alone, but she's actually inviting other people into that space with her. The second thing she does is think practically about preparation that needs to happen. For her to be successful going into the king's presence, she has to make the best of her assets. So she's going to dress herself up as much as she can. But I think she's also planning for, well, what happens if she's successful in coming into his presence? So I think that she probably also is making preparation for these feasts. So prayerfully and practically, preparation is really helpful when we go into frontline situations. Well, we know from chapter 5 that she does find favour in the king's presence, but she delays in making her request immediately by way of inviting Haman and the king into a feast. Why does she do that? I think you could think that maybe it's about lulling the king into contentment with nice food in his tummy, and then he's ready and soft for a more favourable reply. But I think that it's actually more about buying time and seeking a better opportunity. And so this is something that we can think about. How do you create opportunity using wisdom, patience and tact? I think the feast was a way to get the king and Haman to a more private space, because it was a difficult conversation that she was going to have to enter into. And to take it away from the public space of the court and try and address the concern also preserves the king's dignity. So it's stopping this loss of face that is so important to him. Why the second banquet? Well, it might be about showing more honour, layering up the value. We know that the king clearly likes feasts, but maybe she sensed the timing wasn't right. I don't really know, but there is a sense that she was willing to show patience and wait for the right moment, and her approach worked. Haman was punished. The edict for evil intent was countered with another edict that empowered the Jewish people to protect themselves. The king ended up with a better trusted advisor in Mordecai. Another feast and celebration was had. So there we have it. Esther was placed in a difficult situation on the front line of a massive battle on behalf of a nation, and she was faithful to face the challenge with courage, wisdom and tact, with what she had to hand, but also trusting in a God much bigger than herself. So we can all reflect on her story and apply insights to our own situations, asking things like, what is before me? How might I gain a better understanding? What fears and limitations must I face? How do I increase my view or perspective so that I can use the influence and skills that I have to hand to meet these challenges, but I can also trust in God for the things I don't have? How might I act? What prayerful preparation shall I make? Looking for ways that I can create opportunities. And all of this is done really to act out the goodness of God for the sake of those around us. And that's kind of what Esther did in the story. So this is what we can do to be faithful on the front lines. May God bless you as you reflect further on his word and what he might be saying to you today.